we need Jerry Pinto, because I've got to make sure that my explanation for the title of this particular event is correct. But Jerry Pinto appears to have skedaddled. He may be having a cup of tea, quite possibly. Explain, here I can see him wandering into the hall at a leisurely pace. But the origin of the title of Me Great Granddad Had a Camera comes from a translation of a Malayalam story or novel by Muhammad Bashir, am I right? Which was rendered as Me Granddad Had an Elephant. And what we've got here is, I mean, I thought it could have been a sort of Liverpudlian phrasing, but I'm told by Jerry Pinto that it's a Cockney phrasing. My great-granddad had a camera. And the important point for Christopher Penn is, I think I'm right in saying, that you didn't discover this remarkable family story until around about the year 2000.
That's better. Yes, I discovered in my father's bureau, stuck behind the top drawer, a letter from a cousin Patricia, who I'd never heard of. My father didn't speak about his family for reasons which I now understand.
We'll come on to that.
We'll come on to that. So shall I go on with what happened after?
So I think actually maybe what we should do is, before we talk about the specific story of your great-grandfather and your gradual discovery of it, is let's just sort of take a moment to think about what kind of photography he was doing. You've got this beautiful slide here, which I think is taken off the beach in Madras in the 1880s?
This is dated about 1870, and it's a catamaran, as you can see, with the old pier of Madras behind it.
Exactly, launching the catamaran off the beach. And the story of photography in India, I think, begins really in the 1860s in a serious way, when you get a kind of ethnographic chronicling, which is slightly similar to work that was being done both officially and unofficially by people of mixed backgrounds, some people of Indian heritage, some people of British and European heritage, where there was a kind of classificatory process going on, where a rock, a temple, a tree, a place, a building, a certain kind of person was often captured through a very detailed drawing or painting. And I think that the kind of images that we're talking about this evening, which are mainly from southern India in the later part of the 19th century, are almost like sort of staged photographic representations of what previously would have been done by an artist. Would that be a fair way to describe them?
That's absolutely right. Before photographic pictures were available, they were simply drawings or engravings, general engravings, and these were, of course, of limited circulation.
And the kind of pictures that he took, it might be a washerman, it might be a water carrier, it might be a coachman, it would be somebody with a particular social function. It might be the individual, or it might be 3 or 4 people together, sometimes in a staged or semi-staged photo. It did occur to me that this one, presumably the lithe man on the left, would have had to remain extremely still. I mean, how long would the exposure of the photo have taken?
So it would take at least 10 seconds that he would be holding. The whole process was looked on almost as a form of alchemy. People almost didn't understand how it happened, because after that photograph was taken, it then had to be put on to a glass plate, and then subsequently developed. But it was, people didn't understand it at all. And as you say, the exposure would have lasted at least 10 seconds. So that poor chap standing there in a very graceful pose, isn't it, for 10 seconds?
It is. So, I mean, the figure of your great-grandfather, he grew up in the south of England, west of England. He was coming from Somerset, and it would have presumably been quite a sort of brave and innovative and challenging thing to do, to go to a different country, take up a new technology, and invent himself, really, as a photographer.
Patrick, is this working or not? Better. You're so absolutely right, but I wish we knew more about it. All that we do know is that he had left home before he was 12, that he arrived in Madras in 1864, aged 15, and already trained as a photographer.
Okay, so that's amazing. I hadn't actually grasped that. I noticed that he then got married quite soon after that.
He got married some time after that.
Some time after that. Okay.
I mean, he was a precocious lad, but I think 15 was a bit.
Okay, so he was in his early 20s and his wife was 16?
Yes, well, after he landed here in Chennai, he was sent up to Ooty to run the studio for the firm.
Okay, so the firm that he was employed by was, was it a small operation? I mean, how many people would have been doing photographs in Ooty at that time?
How many people? There would have been one or two firms at most. And his firm, which was called Nicholas Brothers, there were the two brothers, 2 or 3 assistants. It was very small indeed.
And how did he decide what he was going to photograph or who he was going to photograph? I mean, the strange thing is that in your book there are so many amazing plates of very high quality photographs. Presumably there are lots of other ones that have disappeared into the mists of time. But I mean, from your research, what did they choose to photograph and why?
Well, the first job, and we have very few of these, were simply portraits in the studio. As the market developed for photographs that visitors could take home with them as mementos, then the photographics spread to beautiful scenery, characteristic figures, and so on.
And I mean, would they have printed them and sold them to tourists, to people who were living there? Would they have had an official function?
In Ooty, it was almost certainly entirely to tourists who were passing through. There was a very limited local market, and in Ooty, because it was a hill station, the work was almost entirely in the 6 months of the hot season, between April and September. And as you said, apart from photographs in Ooty, in the cooler months, there would be less visitors, and people would come back down to the plains.
Okay, I'm now just swapping microphones. And I mean, were there any government regulations? I mean, were there times when people had to have, let's say, precursor versions of what then became the passport photograph? Would people have been obliged to be photographed, or was it something done for fun?
Not that I know. I'd have no suggestion at all that people were required to be photographed. No, the photographs that he took were ones that essentially were wanted by the market, and the market was travellers.
Right. Because I mean, I slightly felt looking at them that they reminded me a bit of Instagram photos, in that they were beautiful landscape shots, or they were people very much done up for the camera. In other words, they were not in any way casual pictures of buildings or of trees or of landscapes or of people. It was always about what is the absolutely most stunning presentation that we can make.
I wish I knew more about Instagram. I'm of the generation which doesn't really understand Instagram.
Okay, good. Now that gives me the opportunity to ask the students in the audience, would you put this picture on your Instagram feed? Okay, good. Okay, some hands are going up. I think what I'm really meaning is that there's a sort of period after photography goes popular, really in the sort of early sort of first half of the 20th century, when a different kind of picture starts to be taken, and increasingly now pictures are being stylized in a way that slightly echoes the early decades of photography.
I mean, that's so interesting. It never occurred to me. But what happened was, as I say, it was thought it was a form of alchemy, and it was very painstaking to produce a photograph like this. But then, 30 years later, in 1888, the Kodak camera was introduced, where people could just snap their own photos, and it became a popular pastime. It was no longer the work of the professional photographer, and that ruined the market for the commercial photographer like Penn. And in fact, he had to close his business and start again in 1899. Okay, so
let's now go back a little bit to the historical circumstance. Talk a little bit about your discovery of the years when it was going reasonably well for him, the time quite soon after he got married, the prime of his career. Can you just describe what you've discovered about that a little bit?
Well, it's a challenging question because we have absolutely no information about him apart from the photographs that he left behind. There's the only written record I have from A.T.W. Penn is a letter to his granddaughter written in 1909. Everything else has been worked out or assumed from the photographs, and the information on those has largely come from advertisements which he placed in the South of India Observer, which told me roughly where he had gone and how what photographs, what subjects he'd been taking. So how he used to work was that the studio was set up here in Ooty, and that was there to take portraiture, and he would have had an assistant who would have helped with that. And if he was away, they could still take portraits. There was no problem with that. But every year he went on trek through the whole of South India, bringing back bits and pieces. He was sometimes, as I think you may have been thinking of, he was sometimes required by the governor of Madras to accompany the governor on his trips and make a photographic record of where the governor was going and what was happening.
And I mean, what sort of apparatus, what sort of camera, what sort of equipment would he have needed in order to be a photographer in those early days?
Well, it was all very mysterious. They had a large tent in which they would develop after the photograph had been taken. The photograph is taken on a glass plate coated with wet collodion. And that whole process was very, very carefully done and difficult to do. And sometimes there were serious accidents, as happened with A.T.W. Penn on one occasion. After the photograph had been taken, it then had to be developed on the glass plate in complete darkness. And subsequently, the glass plate, when it was being developed, would be placed with an albumen paper substrate from which it would produce the glass plate was the negative, and the substrate would be the positive.
And the developing would have been done inside a small tent by his assistant?
No, the developing could be done outside. It was only the process of with the collodion plate being developed.
That was done inside the tent.
That had been in the dark. Once that had been done, once you had a negative on it could be carried anywhere.
But it was still made of glass, so it was very fragile.
Made of glass. And so whenever he was going out to take a photograph, even if he was just going down to Lord's Falls, I say only just that was 20 miles down, 20 miles back, but he would do that journey more than once, but frequently.
And do you know who his assistant had been? Do you have the identity of that person?
No, we don't. We know that he trained later a lady called Mrs. Edelge's father, called Hathary, and I have one photograph which he has taken. But he was trained to take over. He wasn't one of the assistants. And he would certainly have had assistants. When he went out, he would have had to have had either a cart or a wagon, or possibly a number of porters, because they had to carry the tents, they had to carry all the chemicals, they had to carry the glass.
I think it would have been easier to take a photograph in 1866 than to get to speak on.
I think what you probably need is somebody with a better voice, don't you? Anyway, this seems to be better. Also, this one can't be moved away, can it?
And can you tell us just, some of the places round here where he took photographs? Just describe some of the settings.
Well, he took all of the picturesque views in which this place landed. If you get a booklet on the Nilgiris today, you'll see all the sorts of views which he took. From Lamb's Rock, looking down the valley towards the Metabaliam. And then on the other side, he used to go right over towards Goudalore, and the whole of that side. So you get these great photographs with magnificent mountains and also the clouds coming up. There was a period when he was so fascinated by the movement of clouds, rather like Constable was doing on Wimbledon, in London. He was so fascinated, he did a series of cloud views where you could see the clouds mounting up behind the mountains behind. So that was the landscapes. Then, of course, there were also the people. And he was particularly interested, because visitors were interested, in the Toda people of the mountain, of the plateau. And so a very large number of his photographs were concerned with the Toda, but also the other tribes as well.
And he took pictures of the Maharaja of Mysore and the Nizam of Hyderabad, am I right?
Yes, you're right.
How would that process have happened, do you think?
I think the Nizam wanted his photograph taken. And Penn would simply have... in fact, in that particular case, he didn't go to the Nizam's palace in Hyderabad. The Nizam was spending his summer, hot season, here in Ooty, and he sat in Penn's studio, because I know from the from the decoration behind him, he was sitting there in the studio like anybody else, even though he was
right. Because the
Nizam.
You make a reference to what you learned from the Al-Qazi collection, but my impression is that the main photographic studios that were in Calcutta at that time would in most cases go out to the palace of the Raja, the Maharaja, the Nawab, and it would be very much a stylized set of the ruler and the ruler's family within the palace. Whereas, as you're saying, he got the people to come to his studio.
Yes, there were... I don't know, have a single photograph which you would call stylized. It's a very interesting point. He was actually recording people as they were.
And just to sort of take up that point, I think what's interesting about the ethnographic portraits is that they are recording people as they are. There's less of, if you like, the external gaze than you get in other pictures by photographers at that time. It almost seems as if it's done as a snapshot of life, as if that's what he wanted to record.
Yes, I'm sure that's right. Because what the photographers, what not only Albert Penn, but others wanted to record was life as it was then, because they could feel that the Western civilization was sweeping into the subcontinent. And it was important to make a record of people as they were, how they lived, and what they did. But this wasn't done sort of blatantly. There's one lovely photograph that he's taken, which is simply entitled "A Roadside View." But when you look at it, it actually shows precisely how a basket was manufactured. You've got the different stages going through and the finished product. And also up on the right-hand side, you've got a rattan mat being dried out. And so they were concerned to make certain